It is the year 3063 and the Taurian Concordat is marching to war. Just 3 years prior, the figurehead of the nation, Geoffrey Calderon, was taken hostage and killed on Christmas Eve by rebellious colonial forces. As one of the youngest protectors of the Taurian Concordat in recorded history, and with no apparent heir to pass the mantle to, the title was awarded to the former planetary governor, Grover Schraplin. Believing that the Federated Sons were responsible for the death of the former protector, Schraplin made deals with the Capellans. Part of his end of the deal meant contributing men and material to Capellan war efforts, raising new units from planetary militias and sending them into Capellan front lines left the Taurian homeworlds weakened. As such, the Taurian Defense Force approved the contracting of mercenary groups to guard targets deemed of minor importance. It is here, on the backwater planet of Orkney III, that the mercenary organization Polaris Security Solutions found their employment. The pay was not especially lucrative, but the weary mercenaries were eager to deploy to a posting far from the front lines of the FedCom Civil War. With ties to both realms, but no lost love for the leaders of either the Lyrans or the Davians, getting out and letting the Royals duke it out seemed the most prudent course of action. Little did they know that their backwater garrison contract would end up being a fight for their very survival. Split across the planet's surface, Able Company's battle mechs make their patrols, while the motor pools of Baker Company undergo routine maintenance. While patrolling the outskirts of Eiston City, Omega Lance was informed of hostile battle mechs firing upon the planetary garrison units. They moved to intercept this unknown force at the city limits. Omega Lance is comprised of regular pilots. They have seen combat before, but are not the grizzled veterans that are the result of decades at the controls. Not much is known about the hostile force. They are painted to match the surrounding marsh, so it's obvious that some level of planning went into this attack. On the city outskirts, both sides utilize the abandoned infrastructure for cover, waiting to see who makes the first move. An exchange of fire takes place as soon as the mercenaries break cover, with PPCs crisscrossing the battlefield. A Centurion squares up with the mercenaries' Lance's Staff Sergeant John Byrant, and the two trade fire. A lucky critical hit from the invader wrecks an actuator, dropping the Star Slayer to the mud. The Vindicator, piloted by Sergeant Kaya Whaley, positions itself in the middle of the street to block invaders from moving up to the downed Star Slayer. Luckily, Byron is able to regain his footing as the Griffin pilot Drew Trussell backs up Whaley. Careful shooting over the Vindicator's shoulder lays the invaders low, causing them to fall back into cover. Cover is no obstacle for a skilled Griffin pilot, however. Leaping to the rooftops with the assistance of jump jets, both Trussell and Byron claim the high ground and rain retribution down upon their attackers, pushing them further out of the city's confines. Having lost all armor covering the vulnerable engine housing, the Centurion makes a hasty retreat, only to be confronted by Sergeant Major Rowan Benson's Ossol, who has spent the entire match making a flanking maneuver. The Ossol nearly finishes off the Centurion, but it manages to escape into the surrounding terrain. Rather than pursuing, Benson instead pressures the enemy dervish, pressing behind it. With constant firing raining from the high ground, and pressure moving up from the flank, the invaders decide to quit the field and move at maximum speed into the surrounding hinterlands, disappearing into the immense jungles. The mercenaries control the battlefield for now. Unable to pursue with a damaged actuator, the Lance awaits a rapid field refit of the damaged Star Slayer. Utilizing hovercraft from Theta Lance, the mercenaries track the hostiles' path of exfiltration, leading deeper into uncharted territory. When a Whirlwind Scout fails to report back or answer attempts at communication, there is only one explanation. The battle will continue. Omega Lance, having fought off the invaders, links up with Theta, a recon armor lance, and prepares to give chase. Theta has a few mechs to overhaul and has to make a quick field refit before they can pursue their attackers into the jungle. But Theta sends a couple scouts in the form of Savannah Master hover tanks. When two of these vehicles don't respond, the Polaris forces move in to track them and are ambushed in the jungle. Invader mechs and armor ambush them as they attempt to recover the two Savannah Master hover tanks. When the Polaris forces arrive on the battlefield, the two Savannah Masters appear to have been abandoned. The battlefield, however, was not empty. Desert Scorpion light tanks are lying in wait and spring the trap. When the Polaris security forces move in to try and secure their vehicles, the light tanks descend upon them, firing at close range. A point-blank brawl ensues. The Polaris security forces are fast and have the initiative, so they're able to encircle their foe to exploit their weaknesses. When Theta light armor moves in to support, the enemy begins to buckle. The remaining Savannah Masters from Theta exploit the weak rear armor of the mechs. With the trap having failed, the unknown battle mechs flee into the jungle. With a decisive victory, the Polaris forces managed to secure 2 battle mechs and 2 vehicles as salvage. They returned to POTS Limited to regroup. Omega and Theta attempted to reach Alpha for further instructions, but were unable to raise the company command. Unable to contact command, they stashed their salvage. Meanwhile, at the northern part of the continent, 2 more invaders emerged from the jungles. They marched on Cell Metalworks. Sensors pegged this as an assault lance supported by armor assets. At the Metalworks, the only garrisoning units were Upsilon, a cavalry lance consisting of infantry transports, and Lambda, a support lance consisting of infantry. Beta was quick to respond, closing the gap between Briarholm and Cell Metalworks to try and extract the pinned-down armor assets. If Beta didn't move quickly, the entirety of Baker Company's command structure could be destroyed in one fell swoop. Beta managed to slip around the invaders, making it to the southern edge of the city. From there, they were able to rally the armor assets and the infantry assets and get them ready to extract. The heavy battle mechs en route to Cell Metalworks would slaughter any who remained, and Alpha was still not responding to any communications. Before they could escape, the invaders arrived. Now there was only one option left: break through the lines, reunite with Alpha, re-establish communications, and fight off these invaders. The battle will continue. It is the year 3063, and on a backwater planet, a mercenary outfit is fighting for their very survival. In the northern part of the continent, Battletech has just received word a large force of unknown enemies is marching on the Cell Metalworks. With the command structure MIA, Staff Sergeant Dalton Weiss takes command, leading Battletech to respond. Racing ahead through the southern entrance, Weiss takes command of the situation and prepares Lambda to exfiltrate with their transports. 3 platoons of infantry are loaded upon Maxim transports, start to make their way out of the city. Thick flood walls surround the city, so they must break out of the northern gate. In the absence of Alpha's leadership, they must, at all costs, break through the enemy lines and reach Renzik spaceport. Their Fortress-class dropship, the North Star, is their only means of leaving this planet. A quartet of Hetzer assault vehicles wheel their way into position at the edge of the city. They lie in wait, ready to catch any units attempting to exit the city limits. Lance Commander Dalton Weiss and his Firefly picks up on the danger. He orders his Lance to deploy behind the cover of the buildings. Escape awaits them on the other side of the city if they could break through this line. The slower heavy and assault mechs follow the Hetzers and soon block off all the exit points and block all the roads. With clear lines of fire down every avenue, this will be a bloody brawl. Maxim transports carrying the infantry of Lambda stack up behind a building and await a chance to make a break for it. The enemy knows they're trapped like fish in a barrel, and only have one way to go. Without much indirect fire capabilities, they're going to have to push through the enemy blockade. Advancing in a grim march, the battle mechs of the invaders know that they don't need to go very fast, that the enemy will soon come to them. Battletech leverages the cover of the buildings to get as close to the enemy as possible before they have to engage. The Hetzers, having wheeled into position, are content to wait patiently. Unable to delay any longer, the Maxim transports take off at breakneck speed down the main causeway. The Warrior VTOL flies overhead, giving them some cover. They select their target and prepare to focus their fire to bring down one of these heavy foes. The Awesome is quick on his triggers, but fires a trio of PPCs into the transport. One of the transports is struck and bears the full brunt of the attack. The Thunderbolt proves to be even more deadly. He hits the majority of his shots. There's little armor remaining on the stricken Maxim hovercraft. Although nothing critical was hit, things are not looking good. With careful coordination, the returning fire from the transport strips most of the armor off of the Awesome, leaving its structure exposed. Despite this, the Awesome appears to be in perfect working condition. The Warrior-class VTOL misses entirely and does not contribute to this. Accepting the challenge, the Thunderbolt charges forward, giving the Awesome pilot a brief reprieve. The pilot of the Awesome wisely decides that discretion is the better part of valor and falls back. Hearing the gunfire, the Atlas and the Catapult quicken their pace. Their current position does not give them advantage of the ongoing firefight. Attempting to interdict the enemy before they can pop one of the transports, Lance Commander Weiss clears the building, tethering his jump jets to land in a perch upon a short building nearby. Corporals Pitt and Weiss do not like their odds and are recalled to the Lance Commander's side to try and concentrate their forces. Sergeant Asher Lamb and his fleet also moves forward to support the advance. Keeping their momentum, the hovercraft race by, some wheeling to turn and face the weaker rear armor of their opponent. The lead Maxim guns for the injured Awesome, hoping to finish it and create a space for the rest of the force to break through to safety. The Hetzers, however, have other plans. They spring the trap, jumping into point-blank range to unleash their mighty autocannons. Seizing his own opportunity, the Awesome pilot is perfectly positioned to drill 3 PPCs into the rear arc of one of the Maxims. Shots boil armor plates off the transport, but nothing critical was damaged. Scout Mexa Beta crossing the open field, the Atlas loses his entire payload on the Locust as it tries to cross the open ground. The Locust suffers only a glancing blow from the Atlas's weaponry, but the armor plates are sent careening into the open field. The Catapult also unleashes its PPCs, and in a flash, the Locust is gone. Corporal Weiss has but a moment to scream before the comms are cut short. Enraged, Sergeant Lamb unleashes his full complement onto the Thunderbolt, but it does little damage to the stock attack. In battle, there's no time to mourn, and Lance Commander Weiss unleashes his full complement on the Thunderbolt as well. Coordinating their fire, the Maxims follow suit. The weak rear armor of the Thunderbolt crumples under the assault from the heavily armed transports. The Hetzer's own volleys take out one of the Maxim hovercraft. An entire platoon of infantry are vaporized in an instant as the Maxim explodes. Luckily, the remaining Hetzers do little damage to the other Maxim transports, merely hitting them with glancing blows from their massive autocannons. The lead Maxim ignores the Hetzers gunning for the already damaged Awesome. Its shots break through the armor, shattering internal components. This will affect the Awesome's ability to move, slowing the already considerably slow assault mech. Now desperate to salvage the situation, the Lance Commander orders the remaining armor to move at maximum speed and escape the enemy. Darting through back alleys, they make their escape. The Warrior-class VTOL follows suit, providing air cover for their egress. And Commander Ian Schmidt decides to sell his life, knowing that his slower tank will never be able to make it outside of the city. He orders his crew to trundle forward and engages its heavy SRM batteries into considerable damage. The Commander Weiss orders his mechs to try and break through in a last-ditch effort to clear the city limits, and they break into a sprint. The Atlas appears to be their leader, and he pushes his slow assault mech forward into the city square. They attempt to catch some of the fleeing mechs of Beta Lance. With his motive systems damaged, the awesome pilot is unable to get his mech to round the corner fast enough. The Hetzers whirl around, hoping to catch their enemies in the back as they run. Cornered now and desperate, Lance Commander Weiss triggers his weapons for a final time against the Awesome. He scores a critical hit on the engine, further crippling the mech's ability to move. The Awesome returns fire, clipping the lighter mech. The Catapult K2, confident in their victory, unleashes its fury on Tank Commander Schmidt's vehicle at point-blank range, but the heavy armor weathers the blow. Corporal Pitt, caught by a full barrage from the pair of Hetzers at his rear, goes down hard. The Atlas follows up with a salvo of its own, ensuring that he never makes it to safety. So too is Sergeant Lamb and his fleet, also gunned down, never to see another battle. With the screams of the dying echoing over his communicator, Stat Sergeant Weiss cuts his comm link. Tank Commander Schmidt's battle cries are cut short. The Lance Commander knows what that means as well. A mighty barrage of SRMs fails to take down the catapult, despite ripping much of the armor from its carriage. And Commander Schmidt is encircled now, so he backs up, trying to protect his flank with the building. Hopes that his armor can hold out, at least long enough to take one of these bastards down with him. Smelling blood in the water, the invaders close in on the remaining targets. Beta Lance's commander shoots his jets, leaping to the top of a nearby building and out of sight, preventing the killing blow from falling. Schmidt's crew give it their all, loosing volley after volley of SRMs into their foe, but it does not save them. They too boil alive under the combined weight of fire as the heavy mechs ruthlessly burn the tank to the ground. In a spray of armor splinters, the tank detonates, erupting into thick flame and smoke, sending debris cartwheeling over the rooftops. No ejection pods can be seen. The image of that scene burned upon his memory as Sergeant Weiss turns his Firefly away. Beta Lance was broken. Lambda, gutted. The survivors fled, praying for their equipment to hold, to not suffer a failure, as their mounts carried them from the field. Lance Commander Weiss attempted to reach Alpha Lance again, but to no avail. Something was blocking their long-range communications. Even Omega and Theta Lances were unresponsive. Forensic Spaceport was their last shot off this planet. Surely this enemy had not taken the Fortress-class dropship, the home of Polaris Solutions, from the mighty grip of Alpha Lance, had they? With no way of knowing what awaited their battered forces at the spaceport, both Beta and Lambda carried on at maximum speed, hoping their pursuers would not catch them. What they could not know is that Alpha Lance had already fought a fierce battle, one that the survival of the entire outfit depended on. It is January 21st, 3063. Before the battle for Eyston City, conflict with far greater intensity kicked off at the distant Renzik spaceport, the current landing site for the Polaris Security Fortress-class dropship, the North Star. Polaris had been on planet for several weeks now, and were becoming intimately familiar with their patrol routes, to the point of becoming bored with them. Alpha Lance, serving as both the battalion HQ and primary defending unit of Polaris assets at the spaceport, observed the day-to-day operations of the trading port. Nothing marked this day as a special day, with several small trading craft disembarking their cargo and lifting off again, a normal sight for a periphery world dependent on others for necessities. The sensors of the North Star were not as effective once in the muggy confines of the Orkney atmosphere, and almost failed to notice an unregistered vessel entering planetary orbit from an unknown origin vector. Shortly after registering this alarming contact, communications beyond the confines of the spaceport ceased entirely. Met with only static, Commander Bridgewater was unable to raise the remainder of his battalion, scattered as they were across the continent on their normal patrol routes. There would be no time to send couriers. Tarian planetary militia forces, now on maximum alert, began scrambling to deploy defenders. The bulk of the military hardware had already departed for Capellan space to uphold their end of the treaty signed by Grover Schraplin. But several armored vehicles mobilized upon the spaceport tarmac. Outer perimeter guard towers only managed a brief report of contact before being quickly silenced. Without solid intelligence to formulate a better plan, and no way to signal for the recall of his battalion, Commander Bridgewater ordered his lance to prepare for contact with an enemy of unknown size and origin. The North Star was the only way off the planet. If they could not survive the onslaught of these mysterious and well-organized foes, there would be no chance of survival for any of the scattered members of Polaris. Soon, an entire company of hostile battle mechs breached the perimeter of the walled city of Renzik. The enemy company on the field consists of a fire support lance, a medium battle lance, and a regular battle lance. Planetary garrison forces consist of a lance of striker vehicles, as well as a lance comprised of SRM carriers and laser-equipped Hetzer vehicles. Lastly, Polaris Security Lance Alpha of Able Company, led by Commander Paul Bridgewater in his Blood-Asp Prime. Second in command is his right-hand man, Lieutenant Landon Carpenter in his Devastator. Sergeants Dana Watcher and Nico Clemens round out the lance in their Caesar and Warhammer, respectively. The battle took place at the breached perimeter wall. A civilian residential area was located here. Wanting to minimize civilian casualties but lacking time for a full evacuation, defenders were caught by the attacking force. Commander Bridgewater ordered the collected forces to ready themselves, intending to shield civilian residences. The scenario played was a King of the Hill variation, hold them off. One objective: the defender gains 100 VP each turn they successfully defend the point from attackers. The attackers gain 300 points per turn if they hold the objective. with the game ending after 3 consecutive turns with the objective under attacker control. The defenders were considered to be desperate, as this is one of the most critical facilities on the entire planet. This allows them to ignore the forced withdrawal rule. Round 1. The invaders had split their forces, simultaneously breaching the wall in 2 points to the west and the east. Alpha Lance maneuvered to lock down lanes of fire on either side. The planetary garrison vehicles did their best to remain hidden from view. The battle and command lances of the invading force marched en masse from the west breach. The fire support lance encircled via the east breach. In the opening shots of the engagement, the Vindicator traded shots with Clemens' Warhammer, striking a point of armor from the venerable mech. The Hunchback pilot took advantage of Bridgewater's exposure of rear armor, letting loose a mighty barrage, but failed to do significant damage to the Blood Asp. The Wolverine opted for the more obvious target and dealt minor damage to the thick hide of Lieutenant Carpenter's Devastator. Meanwhile, Bridgewater unleashed a hellish volley from his Blood Asp, marking the enemy archer in the fire support lance for destruction. Carpenter's Devastator followed his lead and drilled his own Gauss weaponry into the unfortunate mech. The combined onslaught slagged 11 points of damage away from the archer, reducing it to the barest minimum of remaining structure and critically damaging the fusion engine within. Clemens' return fire at the Vindicator proved to be ineffective, splashing against the thick debris shielding the mech. The entire command lance of Invader battle mechs attempted to leverage Bridgewater's exposed flank. The cover in the distance proved to be ample defense, however. The civilian structure did not escape the stray fire and suffered heavy damage. Civilians cried out and fled the scene, scattering throughout the surrounding city in a mad stampede to escape the devastation. The coinciding return fire from the fire support lance targeted Bridgewater alone. They recognized that his terrifyingly powerful clan technology posed the greatest danger to them. The warheads erupting around the assault mech only managed to dislodge a paltry few points of armor, however. Remaining hidden from hostile fire, the vehicle crews motioned angrily at civilians and ushered them in the direction of safety to the rear. Round 2. Commander Bridgewater unveiled his uncanny combat intuition and executed his actions so quickly that the invaders had no time to respond. He maneuvered his mech into position rapidly and discharged his full arsenal into the advancing Crusader, opening giant rents in its armor and reducing its armor effectiveness completely. It also inflicted a critical hit upon the Crusader's weaponry. Wresting back control of the initiative, the invaders outmaneuvered the defenders and were able to anticipate their movements. The Hetzers raced into the street, tailed by a pair of SRM carriers, now free to position themselves without the hindrance of civilian obstruction. Hoping to prevent further collateral damage to civilian infrastructure, they positioned themselves as far from the safety of the buildings as they could muster. The medium battle lance moved to take up firing positions opposite the block's central clearing. This vantage point provided clear lines of fire into the defending Polaris mechs. The defenders anticipated this and timed their own movements to square off with the oncoming lance, avoiding the cover of the undamaged residences as much as possible. Bridgewater ordered Carpenter's Devastator back to support the main defense, confident that he could hold his own against the fire support lance to his front. the invader command lance spread out to prevent the garrison vehicles from easily flanking the slow mechs. The striker lance raced into the street behind the carriers and hetzers, arming a volley of long-range missiles. The Crusader and the Archer of the fire support lance, having suffered near catastrophic damage and still remaining close to their point of entry, opted to cede the battlefield while they could. Both mechs retreated past the barrier and out of sight. Carpenter delivered a powerful blow to the invader Hunchback with the intent of crippling its ability to bring its deadly AC-20 to bear. Many shots connected, stripping 5 points of armor off the invader and leaving its structure exposed. Dana, in her Caesar, battered the enemy Panther, dealing 4 damage and inflicting a critical hit on the motive systems of the lighter mech. Clemens' Warhammer lashed the enemy Vindicator with particle projection cannon fire, evaporating 2 points of armor and scoring a through armor critical hit. This damage reduced some of the Vindicator's weaponry to ash. The entire medium battle lance fired upon the Devastator, shredding 5 points of armor, but failed to do any critical damage to the Juggernaut. The laser hetzers dealt 3 armor damage to the Guillotine, armor running in molten rivers down the Star League-era mech. The Guillotine did not let this affront go without reprisal, and drilled his own considerable weaponry into the lead hetzer, damaging the hapless vehicle's weaponry in the fuselage. The Marauder joined in on the garrison vehicles, preemptively striking the lighter Striker vehicles as they snap off an LRM payload. The Striker exploded, showering hot armor splinters and debris across the street. Finishing what the Guillotine started, the Crockett finished the lead hetzer with a viciously accurate attack. There were no survivors in the ensuing blaze. The LRM barrage rained down upon the invader heavies. The Guillotine received another 3 damage to the armor, leaving it unprotected against further attacks. Meanwhile, the Catapult and the Cyclops both squared off with Bridgewater's Bloodasp. The Catapult's missile volley scattered wide and failed to do significant damage to the clan-made mech, but the Cyclops' autocannon connected in a detonation that stripped 3 additional points of damage from the commander's behemoth. Half of the armor protection on the mech remained. Round 3. The Guillotine, now fully exposed without the protection of armor, sprinted back through the breach and retreated from the field. The defenders, emboldened by their victories thus far, managed to maintain their initiative and outmaneuver the enemy. The Crockett and the Highlander continued their march down the main street, set on destroying the arrayed vehicles before they could flee or use hit-and-run tactics. The Marauder positioned itself to assist the medium battle lance, as it seemed resistance was too strong for the middleweight formation to dislodge. The 3 remaining Striker vehicles ceded ground to the advancing assault mechs, positioning themselves behind a now empty residential unit. Although minimizing collateral damage was still a priority, crewmen's lives were prioritized over civilian infrastructure. The Hunchback and the Panther, also stripped of armor protection, joined the Guillotine in an exfiltration via the west breach to prevent further damage. The Wolverine and the Vindicator braced themselves in cover. They would try and hold out as long as possible against the heavier Polaris mechs guarding the town square. As the invaders marched down the street, 2 tracked vehicles burst forth from the alleyway and closed in to short range, ready to let volleys of potent SRMs fly. On the east side, the Cyclops and the Catapult continued to encircle Bridgewater's Bloodasp, with the Cyclops bracing itself directly behind a small apartment complex as additional cover. Bridgewater didn't let that stand. He deftly swung his assault mech around the small building, expertly flanking the Cyclops. Lieutenant Carpenter sensed the danger he was in of being flanked by the Catapult and put his back to a building to protect the weaker rear armor of its machine. The two sergeants continued to hold lines of fire off the main square. The Vindicator and the Wolverine harassed the Devastator as he repositioned. The thick metal housing of the turbines was enough to shield Carpenter, and the attacks failed to cause damage to his mount. On the west side, the SRM carriers let their fusillade fly. At this range, they were more than deadly, and they managed to inflict massive damage on the targeted Crockett. An arm was sent sailing, weapons included. The laser hetzer scored minor damage to the unprotected rear of the Marauder, but not enough to critically damage any components. The Highlander's returning fire blasted apart the protective armor on the closest SRM carrier's chassis, nearly destroying the firing control equipment of the vehicle. The Crockett's returning fire against the SRM carrier closest to it destroyed armor plating, exposing the structure to the acrid smoke filling the air, but failed to damage anything critical. The Marauder lined up a line of fire on Sergeant Watcher and her Caesar, spreading PPC fire through the surrounding buildings to deal several points of damage to the Polaris mech. Watcher weathered the fire, but would not be able to sustain many more hits of that strength. Her aim shaken, the responsive fire from the Caesar into the medium battle lance mechs dealt 2 damage to the Wolverine, but failed to leverage the full might of the Caesar's weaponry. Lieutenant Carpenter did not make the same mistake, driving melon-sized slug after melon-sized slug of ferro-nickel into the Wolverine, dealing a further 5 damage to the medium mech. Both weapon and motive systems shredded under the impacts. On the east end, the Blood Asp took advantage of the invader Cyclops' carelessness. At such ranges, the bird-legged assault mech could act with a savagery that its nearly comical appearance would not suggest. Although no critical components were damaged in the assault, the Cyclops was left with no armor protecting its internal systems. The Cyclops and Catapult, unable to turn fast enough to keep with Bridgewater's mech, opted instead to go for Lieutenant Carpenter as their target. The resulting barrage left craters and pockmarks in the buildings surrounding him, but little damage resulted from the attack. Round 4. After the devastating losses of the prior rounds, it was becoming obvious to the invaders that they would be unable to dislodge the defenders from this defensive position. The remaining invaders withdrew, ceding the field. It was clear to Commander Bridgewater that this was more than a hit-and-run raid. The care of the invaders to ensure that their equipment remained operational belied a long-term goal. The communications failures could not be an accident, either, and had to be jamming. What was worse, without any confirmed engine kills on the field, there were no ejecting pilots to capture and interrogate, no material to salvage or investigate. Who were these unknown invaders? They were too well equipped for the pirate raids common to the worlds in the periphery. What were their goals? Why attack Orkney? With so many questions left unanswered, Bridgewater had limited options. First priority was the dropship. The North Star was the only way they could escape if the situation continued to deteriorate. That meant his heavy lance could not strike out in a counterattack and could not pursue the retreating invaders. He ordered his lance back to the North Star to undergo field repairs as rapidly as possible. Who knew when the invaders would return and what forces they would bring with them? Commander Bridgewater needed force projection. He needed scouts. He needed to find the source of the jamming and eliminate it. Anchored as they were to the defense of the spaceport, his lance could not achieve this goal. All he could do is hope that his patrolling lances would somehow return to the spaceport, if any yet survived. The first shells of artillery began to fall when dusk arrived, January 23rd of 3063. It is early morning on January 24th, 3063. Omega Lance and Theta Lance, upon determining that there was an artillery bombardment underway at the starport, left the support personnel behind at Potts Limited and attempted to cross Cell Metalworks on a route back to their dropship, the North Star, so that they may aid with the defense. Cell Metalworks provided a convenient choke point that separated the north and the south ends of the continent, but was the fastest route and posed an unavoidable risk. The south end of the facility provided quite a shock when they stumbled upon the burnt husks that were the remains of Beta Lance's scout mechs. Suspecting an ambush, they were not surprised when the forces lying in wait were detected in the heavily industrialized northern district. Heavily outgunned, Sergeant Major Rowan Benson instructed the Polaris forces to prepare for a recon action. It was time to unmask who these murderers worked for. After that, they'd make them pay. Before we start the battle, I'd again like to thank our channel supporters, shown on the screen now. Production Chief, Swanky Tiger. Line Assistant, Derek Burge. And this video sponsor, TuneArt Studios, who designed some 3D printable miniatures for use with Battletech. In future videos, watch out for the sci-fi infantry we are using, link in the description below. Now, onto the battle. We're playing a custom scenario using the Campaign Operations Sourcebook. The objectives are as follows. The attacker secures 100 war chest points per scanned unit. The defender secures 150 war chest points per destroyed attacking unit. The defender can also score a bonus of 150 war chest points if they manage to destroy or cripple at least 25% of the enemy force by turn 4. Both sides can secure a bonus of 400 war chest points if they cripple or destroy at least 2/3 of the opposing force. Round 1. Polaris won the initiative role in the opening round. Omega Lance picked the Mech Lance to be the target of the formation's Bloodstalker special ability, as Omega Lance is a probe lance. Invaders tried to secure long sight lines to provide good lanes of fire. Polaris hugged the cover tight, successfully staying out of sight on the approach. They would need to close to short range to scan targets. Only one Hetzer fired at a Savannah Master round 1, missing the shot, needing an 11 to hit. Round 2. Polaris had the initiative again and moved up as stealthily as possible, whereas the invaders tried to pin them down. The Savannah Masters punched the throttle, gunning around behind the mechs on the right side before they could get a chance to block their movement. The opening volley from the Hetzer glanced off the galleon, ripping a point of armor from it. The only other Hetzer that had line of sight was only able to hit the Starslayer with a glancing blow as well, dealing 1 point of damage to it. Returning fire, the Starslayer gave as good as he got and ripped 1 armor point off the Hetzer. Vincent in his Ost Soul did 2 damage to the Thunderbolt with a fusillade of laser fire. Sergeant Whaley in her Vindicator placed a shot perfectly, hitting the Awesome with 2 points of damage and a through armor critical hit, which resulted in a weapon hit. Sergeant Trussell in his Griffin snapped off shots at the catapult as he vaulted the industrial gantry, but all of his shots failed to connect. The Awesome's own volley snapped a point of armor off the Vindicator in a cascade of particle energy. The enemy Atlas ravaged Benson's Ostsoul, ripping 3 points of armor from it and reducing it to under half its armor. The Thunderbolt showed no mercy and further decimated the Ostsoul, ripping another 3 points of damage from the beleaguered machine, and dealing a through armor critical hit as well as a structural hit. This resulted in the Ostsoul suffering a hit to both its motive systems as well as its fire control computer. The catapult snapped off particle projection cannon shots at Byron's Starslayer, but the shots went wide. A Desert Scorpion light tank threaded the needle and hit the Thunderbolt, chipping a point of damage into the heavy mech. Staff Sergeant Susan Denham's galleon returned fire into the Hetzer point blank, scanning the tank and doing 2 points of damage. The other galleon, although not close enough to scan it at short range, used its active probe to scan the other Hetzer. 3 Savannah Masters lined up their shot into the rear of the Awesome. 2 hit, doing 4 total damage to the weaker rear armor. Since this is at short range, it also achieves a scan of the object. The remaining Savannah Master shot into the flank of the Hetzer, dealing structure damage and inflicting a critical hit on the fire control. Round 3. The invaders take the initiative. Polaris moves Omega and the Galleons and Scorpions. Benson's Ostsoul retreated due to the critical damage he had sustained. The damaged Hetzer escaped, fleeing to safety. The remaining Hetzers took up firing positions with grim determination. The Savannah Masters tore down the street in an attempt to pin the remaining mechs within scanning range. The invader mechs attempted to stay out of range but were too slow and settled for protecting their flanks as much as possible. The active probe-carrying galleons were able to scan both remaining Hetzers. They then turned their guns on the only exposed Hetzer, dealing 3 damage. One Desert Scorpion dealt 1 damage to the closest Hetzer with a glancing shot. The other rolled a lucky critical hit on the Thunderbolt, doing a through armor critical as well as 2 points of damage to the rear arc, resulting in a weapon hit. The mechs of Omega Lance also fired, starting with the Griffin and Vindicator holding the high ground. The 2 mechs had a difficult shot and only dealt 2 points of damage to the Hetzer, but this would be enough to destroy it. Sergeant Bryant in his Starslayer took advantage of the Thunderbolt's recklessness, and hits the rear armor for a total of 3 damage, which strips off the remaining protection of the mech, but fails to do any critical damage. 2 Hetzers opened up on the Desert Scorpion, dealing glancing hits and bringing the light tank down to 2 armor points. The destroyed Hetzer gets a last round off, and surprisingly does a critical hit to the closest galleon. The galleon, already damaged previously, took another 2 points of damage and a weapon critical. 2 Savannah Masters attempted to further cripple the Awesome, but only managed to do 2 damage, which strips off the armor but does no serious damage internally. 1 Savannah Master used its turret to fire at the Thunderbolt. It missed, but succeeded in scanning the target. The last Savannah Master scanned the Atlas. The Atlas split its fire, dealing 2 damage to one of the Savannah Masters, but missing the other it was shooting at. Theta 1 detonates, killing Corporal Cash Reaver in the conflagration. The Awesome and the Thunderbolt both take shots, but miss the zooming hovercraft. The catapult fired at Byrant Starslayer, dealing a mighty blow and ripping 3 armor points off in the barrage. Round 4. With the scans complete, Savannah Masters raced off the field at flanking speed, with the mechs of Omega following as closely as they could. Staff Sergeant Denham also ordered her light tanks to withdraw. One of the crews of the salvaged Scorpions, green and untested, ignored the order. The brave but foolhardy crew performed a dive on the catapult in a last-ditch effort to scan it at close range. The invader mech easily evaded the tank's efforts, and the rest of the invaders tried to position to get parting shots on the Polaris forces. The Thunderbolt sprinted for its own safe edge with no protection left to escape before further damage could be sustained. The plan to scan the catapult foiled, the Scorpion attempted to instead get some last-minute revenge on the Thunderbolt, but the green crew failed to connect any shots with the retreating heavy mech. Staff Sergeant Denham and her companion galleon had no line of sight, having retreated to the edge of the battlefield, and prepared to exit with their intel. The remaining Hetzers attempted to destroy the foolish Desert Scorpion, dealing 2 damage to the light tank. No armor remained. Sergeants Whaley and Trussell, piloting the Vindicator and Griffin respectively, worked together to line up some indirect fire. Whaley spotted for the Griffin in addition to also snapping off a volley at the Awesome, dealing 1 more damage and a through armor critical. But the critical failed to hit anything vital. With Whaley's assistance, Trussell used indirect fire. The LRM spread dealt 1 point of damage and took the last of the Awesome's protection, leaving it defenseless. Benson and Bryant could not fire due to sprinting, but spun to ensure they would not be getting shot in the back. Luckily, the return fire from the Atlas failed to connect with the retreating Ostsol. The volley surely would have crippled the lighter mech. The catapult drilled the green Scorpion with another 2 damage, destroying the brave tank and crew. Round 5. The next turn, the rest of Polaris quit the field, taking the hard-won intel with them. Omega and the remains of Theta retreated the way they came, unwilling to risk further loss of men and material that breaking through the invaders would cause. Instead, they regrouped and reviewed the data that they had retrieved at no small cost. Sergeant Major Benson's blood ran cold. Capellans,
"Looks like it,"
intoned Staff Sergeant Byron flatly over the Ostol's comms. "I don't understand. Didn't the Tarians just send them a shitload of men and materials? And why the odd mix of old and new tech in their forces? This isn't adding up." Benson rubbed his eyes. He had gotten precious little sleep over the last few days, and fatigue was making his mind sluggish.
"More importantly, Sarge, we still gotta get through. Alpha has to be taking a beating at the spaceport."
Byron was right, of course, but how to circumvent this force? They would need a clever plan, but like all clever plans, it might instead go disastrously wrong. Benson contemplated this for a moment before keying his comms. "All right, Omega, here's the plan." The Capellans brought forward their captives, ready to make the exchange. Polaris waited for them, brazen and unflinching, with a high-value captive of their own. Nobody could have guessed at the carnage that was about to unfold, or who the ultimate victor would be. It is the year 3063. The Tarian Concordat, planet of Orkney III, has been the battleground between a mysterious invading force and the planet's mercenary defenders, Polaris Security Solutions. Their prior reconnoiter mission successful, Omega and Theta Lances pulled back to evaluate their next steps. With the Capellan Assault Lance holding Cell Metalworks, the throughway to the spaceport, there was no way to circumvent them while they remained in a blockade of the route. Being professional soldiers, the Capellans were wary of attempts to draw them from their post. Polaris had to change tactics. While undergoing repairs, Sergeant Major Benson had time to go over the intel. Scans from the previous battle had revealed some key details about the invaders. Foremost amongst the revelations was the fact that the mechs were of Capellan Confederation origin. Second was that the captured Griffin pilot was ID'd to be likely Sao Wei Ki Chung, cousin to the Atlas pilot, and former Capellan field commander Zhao Shao Rui Chung. Rui Chung was infamous for absconding with an entire battalion of Confederation equipment and pilots, turning toward a life of piracy. Apparently, they had heard of the recent developments, such as the recent pact between the Tarian Concordat and Chancellor Liao. This prompted an idea. Sergeant Major Benson broadcast on open frequencies. This is Sergeant Major Benson of the Polaris Security Forces protecting this world. I offer a deal to Rui Chung. I am offering to ransom your cousin. The Capellan commander, Zhao Shou Chung, was quick to respond.
So you captured my idiot cousin. What makes you think I will not leave him to his fate?
Benson proposed a prisoner exchange, the Sao Wei for any surviving pilots of Beta Lance. Because you surely don't have limitless pockets, Zhao Shou, or limitless personnel capable of piloting a battle mech. Besides, wouldn't you prefer us in the open rather than in the shadows? You have pilots of ours, surely. We want them back. This exchange will only benefit us both.
So it seems. All right, state your terms.
The venue, POTS Limited. Out of the way and of little strategic import, this would lead the Capellans far afield and limit the involvement of other Capellan forces. With the plan in place, hostage negotiations began. Both forces moved to the arranged meeting spot just outside of POTS Limited. The heavy transport trundled forward, flanked by a Capellan catapult and a thunderbolt. Polaris was already on site, ready to meet the transport with their own. Instead of a heavy troop mover, Polaris had a simple skipjack. The Capellan captive its sole passenger. The vehicle swapped positions, passing each other like ships in the night. The Capellans never had any intentions of making this a fair transfer. Pouring out of the heavy transport, 4 full squads of battle armor leapt for the closest Polaris mech. Polaris never intended for this to be a fair fight either. The sole survivor of Beta Lance, Staff Sergeant Dalton Weiss, led a charge accompanied by 2 Maxim heavy hovercraft transports. Were not going to give up their leverage so easily and sped to peel the mechs off the prisoner's skipjack. The last 2 platoons of Polaris infantry piled out of their transports to add their firepower to the fight. Emerging from the forests, 2 more Capellan mechs emerged. The Centurion and the Dervish, seen in Omega Lance's first battles, returned to liberate their fallen pilot, adding yet more fuel to this now raging inferno. Savannah Masters ripped across the battlefield. Their hover capabilities allowed them to dart around and flank the catapult and the Thunderbolt, adding to the growing number of units focusing on the 2 Capellan pirates. Staff Sergeant John Byrant's Starslayer, backed up by Sergeant Drew Trussell in his Griffin, leapt from the rooftops to engage the pair at close range, rather than suffer the superior medium-range damage of the Thunderbolt. The battle armor leapt to engulf Sergeant Major Benson's Ostsoul and the Vindicator, but the Polaris mechs rapidly backpedaled out of range to avoid being swarmed. Combined laser fire from the suits focused on Kaya Whaley's Vindicator, dealing critical damage that resulted in the mech going down in a heap, the pilot's status unknown. Simultaneous fire from the Vindicator scoured battle armor suits from the field, eliminating a pair of troopers but failing to wipe out a squad. Benson and his Ostsoul finished the job, vaporizing Capellan suits with bursts of laser fire. Byrant and Trussell combined their efforts and tore into the side of the catapult K2, dealing 3 points of damage to the pirate mech. The Centurion and the Dervish fired their own volleys downrange, striking at the closest galleon light tank. The Dervish's missile fusillade went astray and failed to impact, but the Centurion landed multiple hits, resulting in 2 damage to the vehicle. The pair of galleons turned their own weapons on the advancing infantry, ripping apart an entire squad of battle armor in a hellish volley, as the Vindicator burned beside them. The pair of Savannah Masters tore into the flank of the catapult, ripping another 2 points of armor from the rear. 1 armor point remained. The catapult unleashed particle projection fire into the Starslayer, only clipping the mech at close range for 1 damage. The Thunderbolt fared better, but still only managed to drive 2 points of damage into Byrant's mech. This left the Starslayer with half its remaining armor. The Awesome, previously ignored, reminded the Polaris tanks that it is still a force to be reckoned with. From atop the hill, it lashed charged particles across the galleon closest to it, reducing the galleon to a single pip of armor remaining. Rui Chung, bearing the fearsome weaponry of the Atlas, leveraged her considerable marksmanship skill to dump fire into the damaged galleon, detonating it in a shower of armor splinters and molten slag. The lead Maxim unleashed its weaponry into the exposed rear armor of the catapult in an attempt to finish it off. 3 damage ripped through and destroyed some internals, critically damaging its motive systems. The second Maxim's fusillade struck deep into the Thunderbolt, doing a through armor critical, along with 4 points of damage into the hapless pirate mech, compromising the fusion engine housing. Heat poured through the containment, flooding the Thunderbolt, and would render the future weapon controls sluggish to respond. The infantry joined in, firing laser barrages from their personal weapons, aiming for exposed parts of the catapult's internal structure. Although 1 platoon failed to do any significant damage, the 2nd platoon hit their marks and dealt an additional 2 points of damage to the beleaguered catapult. This critically damaged the fire control systems. Dalton Weiss, eager for vengeance, drilled the catapult with a further 2 damage in the catapult's flank, taking down the larger war machine. It was a bloody start to the firefight, but Polaris held firm and kept the initiative. There was no time to mourn their losses. The pirates' defense of the captive crumbled, with the Thunderbolt backing away and attempting to cover his damaged rear arc from the Polaris forces, but to no avail. Polaris troops moved in to secure the skipjack, while the remains of Omega Lance scattered in an attempt to distance themselves from incoming battle armor squads. Byrant, in his Starslayer, raced past the Thunderbolt, wheeling to line his shots up into the heavier mech's flank again. Savannah Masters also raced past, executing similar maneuvers. The Maxims raced to the top of the hill to disrupt the remaining pirate mechs that were attempting to reform a firing line, pinning an Awesome with his back to the forest to protect it from the rapid encirclement of the hover tanks. Rui Chung stomped after Sergeant Major Benson, but the lighter mech had sprinted behind cover, obscuring his mech from the furious Capellan pirate commander. Dalton Weiss's Firefly presented a valuable target to the battle armor squads. Their combined laser fire inflicted catastrophic damage, bringing down the last surviving member of Beta Lance. The platoons of Polaris infantry continued to fire on the Thunderbolt, dealing 2 damage and leaving the Thunderbolt with 1 point of armor remaining. Weiss loosed off his full salvo as his mech went down, dealing another 2 points of damage to the Thunderbolt, and dealt critical damage to the Thunderbolt weapon systems, reducing the damage output by a point. As it was being ravaged by weapons fire, the Thunderbolt unleashed its fury on Drew Trussell's Griffin. Although critical weapon damage was not yet in effect, the extra heat pouring into the mech's internals from the engine containment disruption caused extra difficulty in the Thunderbolt bringing its weapons to bear. This caused the heavier mech to miss enough shots that there was no significant damage caused to the medium mech. The Awesome, atop the hill and nestled in a tree line, drilled a Maxim hover tank with a pair of PPCs, dealing 2 damage to the transport. Rui Chung, frustrated with the elusive Ostsoul evading her guns, turns them upon the exposed Galleon light tank instead. She savages the combat vehicle with 5 points of damage, enough to detonate the tank. Sergeant Trussell used his Griffin's weapons to rip apart a squad of battle armor before they can get close enough to swarm onto his mech, dealing 3 points of damage and destroying the squad. Staff Sergeant Byron focused his weapons into the rear armor of the Capellan Thunderbolt, dealing 3 damage and a through armor critical in addition to the structure damage. This critical damage again strikes the fusion engine, disrupting its containment completely and rendering the mech inoperable. One of the Maxims, despite being closer to the pirate Centurion, ignored the obvious target and shot past it, into the unprotected rear of the Dervish instead, dealing 3 points of damage. The other Maxim targeted the Awesome, landing all of its shots and dealing 3 damage to the Assault class mech. The 2 Savannah Masters, lacking other targets, turned their lasers upon the remaining battle armor squad, picking off 2 points of damage from the squad. The Capellan pirates wrest back the initiative, and Omega Lance attempted to reposition without exposing themselves too greatly. Sergeant Major Benson utilized the cover of the rock formations, lining up his Ostsoul for a shot against the Atlas. Trussell leapt his Griffin to the rooftop, hoping to evade the battle armor bearing down on him. Byron also used the rock formations for cover and hunkered down for a shot on the medium mechs of the Capellan pirates. The Capellans responded by pulling together in a tighter formation atop the hill, attempting to hide their weak flanks from the predation of the speedy hovercraft. The platoons of infantry continued to hold the skipjack. They swarmed about to prevent being an easy target. The last remaining squad of pirate battle armor made the leap to the rooftop, following the Griffin. The Maxims continued to utilize their speed to haul around the hill, positioning to fire through the tree line into the rear arcs of the medium mechs. Having anticipated this move, the Awesome was already moving to flank the flankers, setting himself up to reverse the tactic upon the hovercraft. Rui Chung plodded forward doggedly, intent on smashing through her enemies and liberating her cousin with the supreme firepower of her Atlas. Rui Chung now being out of sight from Benson's position, he decided to instead take a longer range shot at the Centurion on the hill. Benson's experience proved to be a boon, and he landed all 3 of his damage upon the Centurion. The Griffin fired into the advancing battle armor, dealing enough damage to destroy the unit. As this occurred, the battle armor attempted to swarm the mech, but their attacks failed to find any purchase on the mech as they were battered aside. Byrant, obscured by the rock formation, used his firing position to slash across at the Centurion. He dealt 2 more damage to the medium mech, stripping the remaining armor from the mech. The pair of Maxims dumped their weapons through the trees, splitting their fire between the 2 medium mechs. The first dealt 3 damage to the rear of the Dervish, critically damaging the fire control systems of the pirate mech. The second dealt 3 damage into the rear of the Centurion, damaging its fire control systems for the second time this battle, and leaving it with only 1 point of structure remaining. The 2 laser rifle infantry platoons, directed by Byrant, fired at the Centurion in an attempt to finish the mech. The exposed section of the structure crumbled under the exposed weight of fire from 2 full platoons, destroying the medium mech. As it died, it fired all of its weaponry, but with the damage to the fire control systems in the previous round, all of its weapon fire was too inaccurate to provide any meaningful damage to enemy units. The Dervish pilot fared better. He fired a fusillade of missiles into the closest infantry platoon, dealing 2 damage to the platoon and killing multiple troopers in the resulting detonations. The 2 Savannah Masters squeezed off their lasers into the rear arc of the Awesome. Both shots connected, doing 4 damage cumulatively. The Awesome attempted to track the high-speed movements of the Maxims, only managing to hit with 2 points of damage on the closest hovercraft. This boiled off the remaining protection of the Maxim, leaving it exposed to future attacks. As Rui Chung approached the skipjack, she raked the 2 infantry platoons with her weapons, splitting her targeting between the 2 units. Her pinpoint accuracy again came into play, utterly annihilating 1 platoon of infantry and reducing the other to a scant few survivors. The last platoon held out, somehow riding out the damage, but only having a single pip of structure remaining. With the initiative firmly back in Polaris' control, the Dervish fired its jump jets, rocketing over the tree line, beelining for the battlefield's perimeter. Trussell, seeing the devastation of the infantry at the hands of Rui Chung, bravely leapt to the defense of the beleaguered troopers. He placed himself between the advancing Atlas and the few remaining squad members. Byrant flanked around, seeking to line up firing lanes. Benson also broke from cover, making a break for the Atlas while her attention was elsewhere. Rui Chung was not deterred and continued her inexorable advance forward. The Awesome tried to position itself to make its flank less exposed, but this proved unsuccessful. The open terrain allowed a trio of hovercraft to easily outmaneuver the slow and heavy mech. The remaining Maxim flanked the Dervish that was attempting to escape. The Dervish attempted to hit one of the rapid hovercraft, but the fire control damage previously sustained made that an impossibility, when combined with the insane speed of the combat vehicles. Coolly lining up his reticules with the rear armor of the Atlas, Benson squeezed his triggers, letting loose all of his Ostsol's weaponry into the pirate commander's mech. 4 points of damage ripped into the assault-class monster, but this seemed to barely scratch the surface. Taking the cue, the staff sergeant joined in with his Star Slayer, dealing another 2 damage points. Trussell added his own firepower to the barrage, dealing another 2 points of damage to the mech. The Awesome took advantage of Byrant's diverted attention and fired its complement of PPCs into the back of the Star Slayer, doing 3 damage to the Polaris mech, but failing to critically wound it. Rui Chung savagely blasted the Griffin, dealing 3 damage to the medium mech, but it escaped some of her ire. The infantry focused their fire on the incoming assault mech, dealing a solitary point of damage to it, but this failed to breach the thick slabs of armor covering this behemoth. Setting off a ripple of secondary explosions, the Maxim penetrated the undefended flank of the Dervish, destroying the mech in a cacophony of exploding ordnance. The paired Savannah Masters pierced the thick hide of the Awesome with opportunistic rear shots, resulting in catastrophic damage via a critical hit. The Awesome went down in a heap, smoke billowing from its carapace. With the Omega Lance mechs closing in around her, Rui Chung powered down her weapons, signaling her defeat. Although the Atlas was a powerful combatant, she knew that she stood no chance of defeating this many opponents. The losses suffered on both sides were great, but now the biggest obstacle preventing the Polaris forces from coalescing had just been removed. Now Omega and Theta could continue to the starport to rejoin Alpha, if they yet survived. Polaris leadership has been severed. Both Lance leaders lie dead, or at the least wounded, in the biggest assault of their assignment to date. Their subordinates cling to hope by a thread. Victory is within their grasp, but it is equally within the grasp of their enemy. This is the final battle of Polaris Security Solutions in this campaign, and one that would ultimately decide the fate of Orkney III. The sounds of artillery bombardment at the spaceport had all but ceased in the days leading up to the departure of the former Capellans, now turned pirates. Rui Chung was captured, and without her icy direction, the pirates fell to infighting. As Omega Lance and the remains of Theta Lance neared the spaceport, the jamming obscuring Polaris's communications gradually lifted before disappearing altogether. The sight of the spaceport shocked Staff Sergeant Benson. After days of bombardment, the residential areas around the city had been reduced to rubble. The residents had luckily long fled, flocking to emergency shelters in surrounding facilities, but signs of their passing created a sobering scene. The detritus of thousands of lives uprooted, burned in the night. Finally able to re-establish contact with Alpha Lance, what remained of the company was finally reunited. In tow was what remained of their logistical support, including the supply train and the prisoners taken during the battles. Rui Chung was not speaking, having taken to resolute silence in the face of her captors. But her underling, Upta Nadir, was not so coy. Upta Nadir had previously piloted a Griffin, and wished to continue to be able to do so, being offered the chance to be sent along his way with his hereditary family battlemech did much to secure his cooperation. That cooperation would soon become critical. There were no signs of the pirates as they faded back. As jamming faded, optical tracking was able to pinpoint a departing dropship. Tracking the departing dropship as it left orbit, the signal was lost as it disappeared behind the dark side of Orkney III's primary moon. Polaris focused on reclaiming and repairing as much as they could. Tarian aerospace defenses scrambled in system during the following days, expecting to head off the escaping pirates at the jump point, but none were found. The pirate prisoner Nadir earned his value as a cooperator when he revealed what had happened to the pirate dropship. Hidden away on the moon, the pirates had clandestinely repurposed an early outpost constructed in the infancy of human habitation of this system. Surrounded by tall ferric formations, most signals did not escape the caldera of this ancient crater without considerable effort, creating a natural defense. It was the perfect camouflage. It also explained how the pirates had appeared so quickly, mere days after the departure of the bulk of the Tarian defense forces. They had been here the whole time. No TDF ground forces in system could field battlemechs. At this point, there was only one option. Polaris was going to the moon. Ferried by their dropship, the North Star, the forces of Polaris touched down on the barren surface and advanced on the pirate compound. There were trace amounts of atmosphere carrying a small risk of hull breaches and precluding the use of hover or VTOL vehicles. rolling out the remainder of their uninjured battle mechs, as well as their tracked vehicles, quickly refit to be capable of operating in the trace atmosphere. Polaris squared up for a final battle with the pirates that had so plagued them. This battle would be no holds barred. The shooting started quickly. The pirates had already taken defensive positions when the Polaris forces arrived. First to fire was Sergeant Nico Clemens and his Warhammer, lashing at the Capellan Highlander with the long-range touch of his particle projection cannons. The cover shielded the Highlander well, resulting in only a single point of damage taken off the armor. The armor held and no breaches allowed the trace atmosphere to damage the internals of the mech. In return, the Highlander pilot leveled his own long-range weaponry at Nico, dealing a point of damage to the Warhammer's armor, but also failing to produce a breach. Breaking from their cover, the striker formation of Capellan mechs pushed forward, taking ground, while the Polaris pushed forward into the cover of the buildings. The Capellan heavy battle lance also circled their cover. They hoped to keep the thick metal housing of the processors between themselves and their enemies, and shield themselves from incoming fire as much as possible. Each shot could be deadly in this near vacuum. The tanks of Polaris followed suit, trundling up the flank, keeping to cover as they advanced. A lance of Capellan fire support platforms positioned themselves carefully out of sight. They intended to fully utilize their indirect fire capabilities, minimizing damage that they would receive as they rained death upon the battlefield. Staff Sergeant Benson was first into the breach, peeking from behind a structure in his Ossol. He paid for this view when the entire Capellan strike lance opened fire as soon as he entered view. A Capellan Wolverine snapped off a fusillade of fire at the medium-weight mech, ripping 2 points of armor from it. Luckily for Benson, these failed to form a breach to the trace atmosphere. A Pirate Panther also lent his fire to the barrage and snapped off another point of armor from Omega Lance's leader, but again, no breach resulted from the damage. The Hunchback's barking staccato of autocannon fire was deafening even in the thin atmosphere. The range reduced their hitting power somewhat, and only a single point of damage struck the Ossol, yet again failing to produce any breaches. A Vindicator managed to strip the last remaining point of armor from the Staff Sergeant's mount, but without the last vestige of protection, Benson was now completely exposed. The structure held, but any further hits would certainly deal critical damage to his vulnerable components. Benson returned fire instinctively, focusing entirely on the Panther that was the most visible. The laser salvo melted 3 points of armor from the light mech, stripping it of its protection and also causing an atmospheric breach. This resulted in significant damage to the engine housing of the mech. Benson's closest friend, Sergeant John Byron, was also quick on his triggers. The shoulder-mounted laser weaponry flashed brilliantly and struck the Panther as well, seeking to put down the Lance Leader's target. This critically damaged the Panther's particle projection cannon, but to the credit of the Capellan pilot, the Panther yet stood. Kaya Whaley was unable to target the Panther as well, and opted for the next best target, the Capellan Wolverine. The PPC struck true, but the Capellan was deft enough to twist out of the way of her flight of long-range missiles. Drew Trussell was the last of the Lance to fire, arcing a flight of LRMs over the building at the ravaged Panther. The missiles impacted on target, detonating the light mech in a shower of metal fragments. The fire coming from the heavy battle lance of the Capellan pirates was brutal. The Marauder faltered, having traveled too far to identify any targets, but the other members of the Lance did not fail in such a fashion. The Highlander switched targets, instead zeroing in on Commander Paul Bridgewater's fearsome Blood Asp as it thundered towards the front lines. The Capellan pulled his triggers. The Gauss slug impacted solidly and triggered a breach in the atmospheric seals of the clan-produced mech. The engine suffered some minor damage. Not enough to cripple the mech, but enough to render Bridgewater's control sluggish under his hands as heat washed through the cockpit. A Capellan guillotine also let loose with a salvo of its own, but the beams failed to do any significant damage to the commander's battle mech. With no long-range weaponry to add, the Crockett instead opted to spot for indirect fire. the provided firing solutions would be valuable to the Capellan fire support lance. The forerunners of the trundling tracked tanks, the galleons, pivoted their turrets to fire at the only available target. They concentrated their ire on the surviving Vindicator, dealing 2 points of damage, but leaving some armor intact. The Desert Scorpions fired their large lasers at the same target. They scored more damage, dealing 2 points of damage, as well as reducing the particle projection cannon to ruin. The Pirate fire support lance arced their LRM payloads over the rooftops. The missiles reached their azimuth just before plummeting down to rain a series of detonations over Bridgewater's bloodass. It rocked him violently in the command seat, and he struggled to maintain control of his behemoth as the missile stripped a further 2 points of damage from the commander's mount. Incensed, Bridgewater brought his own arsenal to bear. Blinding beams of heavy clan-made lasers washed over the enemy Highlander, who Bridgewater surmised to be the most valuable target. His considerable skill, infused with a bit of the devil's own luck, blessed his attack with withering aim, peeling an Admiral 3 points of armor from the Highlander. Despite dealing a through-armor critical hit and an atmospheric breach to the Capellan commander's mech, none of the core components of the stout assault mech were critically damaged. Nico Clemens in his Warhammer followed up this showing with his own eager volley. The particle beams crackled over the cover, separating him from his target, but failed to connect. Sergeant Dana Watcher leapt to defend her commander, adding her Caesar's arsenal to the bombardment, but also failed to land any significant damage. She cursed loudly, but was cut short by ferric slugs whipping past her to crash through parts of the processor housing and careen into the Capellan Highlander. Lieutenant Landon Carpenter's mighty Devastator had managed to drive Gauss slugs into the pirate commander's mech, which dealt an additional point of damage. The tracked vehicles angled to position themselves better on the edges of the battlefield. In the thick of the fighting, the Capellan strike lance surged forward in an attempt to lock Omega into a close-range battle, where the shorter-ranged weaponry would hit harder. This worked against them as Omega reacted to this surge, placing themselves in advantageous placement to receive the charge. Unfortunately, this prompted the Capellan command lance to act. They broke from their cover, thundering forward at an almost casual gait. Most of Alpha Lance was out of position to fire adequately on the advancing command lance, and had to rush to find firing angles. The fire support lance maintained their positions and braced to continue their indirect fire. The twin galleon light tanks continued their harassment, taking pot shots at the Hunchback this time. This was only minimally effective, and only did 1 point of damage to the Hunchback's armor, failing to cause any breaches. A pirate Wolverine darted into close range, headed straight for Kaya Whaley's Vindicator. It let off a short-range payload. The Vindicator rocked with 2 points of damage, but the armor absorbed the blows. The Capellan's own Vindicator used the other weaponry at its disposal to attempt to damage Staff Sergeant Benson's Ostsole, but its reduced hitting power only resulted in a single point of damage. Luckily, the damage did not critically damage any components, but the exposed structure vented a black oily smoke that signaled the extent of the damage he had already suffered. The Hunchback attempted to get an angle on the Ostsole, but was unable to due to the intervening structures. He instead switched targets to Nico's Warhammer. The cover shielded Nico adequately, with only a single point of damage reaching him. Kaya Whaley retaliated against the oncoming Wolverine, punishing the pirate with 2 points of damage. This resulted in an atmospheric breach in the Wolverine's armor, though no systems took critical damage from the sudden decompression. John Byron, leaping over the obstructing processor, twisted his mech to land facing his target's thinly armored flank. Bringing his array of laser weaponry to bear in all the destructive fury he could muster, he managed to peel through the protective encasement of the pirate Wolverine, dealing 4 damage to the medium mech. Ripping through the thin protection, this damage would critically damage the fusion engine contained within. The Alpha Strike would spike Byron's heat, but it seemed well worth the trade-off. Omega Lance lead Benson fared less well. Desperately clinging to the massive industrial generator, he snapped off a few shots at the oncoming Vindicator, but failed to take it to the ground. A fire control hit was an appreciated secondary effect of his efforts, however. Drew Trussell, piloting a venerable Griffin, came to Benson's aid with a well-placed distance shot from both a particle projection cannon as well as a flight of LRMs, managing to do 2 additional points of damage to the Pirate Vindicator and stripping the mech of its remaining offensive capabilities. The Pirate Command Lance was not about to let this stand. They rushed, focusing on the reeling members of Omega Lance. Byrant was the first target of this onslaught. A pirate marauder whipped a pair of particle projection cannons at the Starslayer, narrowly missing the medium battle mech. The autocannon fared just as poorly. The staccato went wide and cratered a line of divots in the side of a nearby processor housing. Medium lasers whined as heat boiled off the marauder in the vicious attack, but also failed to connect properly, evaded by the arcing jump the Starslayer had performed. The Capellan Crocket also pumped extra power into its weapon batteries, aiming them down at Nico's Warhammer, but most of his attacks impacted harmlessly on intervening structures. 1 point of damage struck true, but failed to explosively decompress the target's seals. Getting desperate now, the Capellan commander leveled his Highlander's weaponry at Benson's wounded Oss-Soul, seeking to finish him off before he could dart away. A Gauss round, along with multiple lasers, slammed into the Oss-Soul and threatened to end its existence, but somehow the medium mech absorbed the 4 points of punishment and held out with a single structure point remaining. The guillotine pilot sensed blood. He poured out 4 points of his own laser-based arsenal downrange. Most splashed harmlessly against the massive generator housing, but several shots struck true. Benson was whipped violently in his restraints as the Oss-Soul pitched over sideways and struck the generator housing, his hand reaching out for the ejection lever before his Oss-Soul was wreathed in a catastrophic explosion. Alpha Lance didn't let up. In fact, the loss of their trusted comrade seemed to spur them further. Nico cycled his own particle cannons at the enemy Hunchback. 3 points of damage racked the medium mech, causing armor panels to burst free in a shower of sparks. Feedback from the PPCs managed to damage the delicate circuitry of the Hunchback's fire control systems as well. Commander Paul Bridgewater was less interested in targets of opportunity. Seeking revenge for his trusted friend, he instead targeted the Crocket, hoping to cripple this massed offensive on the right of his battle line. He paid little heed to the rising heat gauges as he triggered heavy lasers and Gauss rifles at the enemy mech. Paul placed his shots expertly and ripped an incredible 7 points of armor and structure from the hapless target, with several shots fouling the fusion engine within. Dana Watcher Caesar did not sit idly either. She followed her commander's lead and salvaged the Crocket with her own salvo. This did 3 damage and destroyed a valuable actuator in the enemy mech, slowing its pace to a crawl. This all paled in comparison to the fury of Lieutenant Landon Carpenter. Benson had been his best friend, and sometimes rival, over their years of employment under Polaris Security's banner. Not knowing his fate was torture, and the sooner this conflict was over, the sooner they could recover what remained of him, if anything remained. He focused on his closest target, unsure if the sweat stinging his eyes would clear enough to reach further. Triggering his full complement, he drove 2 nickel iron slugs into the unfortunate pirate Hunchback, coring it in an instant. The Hunchback twisted in its death, coming to rest in a flaming heap as shards of its armor clattered across the moon's surface. The fire support lance opted to target closer targets to maximize their missiles' accuracy, relying on targeting telemetry relayed from their compatriots engaged with the enemy. Missiles whipped over the rooftop in a sharp arc. When they descended, they rained round the closest Galleon light tank, ripping 2 points of armor from the light tank and tearing a tread from its tracks. This would slow the tank considerably. Incensed by the destruction of the Oss-Soul, the Polaris mercenaries finally wrested control of the situation back from their pirate opponents. The fire support lance pulled around the building, hoping to finish off the tanks while the rest of the battle line shifted in support of Omega Lance. The light tank spun to face them, but with the damage to the track of one of the galleons, they lacked the speed to fully disengage. What remained of the pirate striker lance pulled back, hoping to reach the safety of their command lance's front lines. This didn't put them outside of Byron's vengeful reach. Triggering his jets once again, recklessly flooding his mech with yet more heat, Byron soared overhead and landed neatly behind the Wolverine yet again. Whaley and Trussell took up more cautious positions behind the structures, seeking to utilize their range advantage. The Capellan Marauder continued to drive directly at Byron. The pilot sought to force him into a confined area. The Capellan commander stomped after his subordinate, unable to reach the safety of full cover, ponderous as his war machine was. Despite the catastrophic damage it had received, the Crockett continued its methodical march, grimly marching forward towards Nico's Warhammer. Nico held his ground equally grimly. The guillotine pilot showed more discretion. He again took position behind a massive processor and its thick casing. The cover provided by this structure would ensure he survived the inevitable coming barrage. Alpha Lance continued to wheel to the left, obscuring themselves from the fire support lance best they could, while they continued to track their targets, pushing the right side of the line. The shooting continued, hellish in its intensity. Byron slashed into the Wolverine yet again with his Starslayer, as the Wolverine attacked its own targets. The 3 damage from this attack was enough to rip limbs off and send the Wolverine crashing down. Kaya Whaley leveled her PPC at her Capellan counterpart, driving a PPC shot into the center of mass and collapsing the medium mech in on itself. The Wolverine's target, Nico's Warhammer, weathered the Wolverine's attacks. Suffering another 2 points of damage caused an armor breach in the Warhammer and explosively ejected critical parts of one particle projection cannon. The 2 galleon tanks fired defiantly at the oncoming attackers. Despite the thick armor of the heavy mechs, the concentrated fire of the 2 lighter tanks managed to cause a decompression breach on the Crusader, ripping apart an actuator and slowing the mech. In total, the Crusader weathered 4 points of damage. The Desert Scorpions add their own firepower, following the lead of the galleons, but the inexperience of the newly recruited crews became evident as all lasers failed to find purchase in the Crusader's armor. The Capellan Marauder rounded the corner, triggering all its available weapons. Byron fell under its targeting. This was premature as only 1 PPC crackled across the Omega Lance veteran, the rest of the fusillade scattering wide instead. Seeing that he would no longer be able to bring Byron down in a single salvo, the Capellan commander switched targets, instead leveling his guns at Nico. The battered Warhammer staggered under the weight of the unexpected Alpha Strike, the barrel of the other particle cannon splitting as he brought the limb up in a warding gesture, claxons blaring, and heat rippling across the entirety of the war machine. The pilot of the Crockett prepared to sell his life dearly. He triggered the heat safety overrides on all of his weapons and fired his entire complement of weaponry at the advancing Blood Asp. This attack savagely dealt 3 damage to the oncoming mercenary commander. The guillotine showed his guile by tracking the target of the Crockett's weaponry. The guillotine pilot coordinated the attack with one of his own, scarlet beams ripping 2 more points of damage into the commander's mech. Molten armor ran down the clan-produced battle mech around an actuator, interfering with its operation and slowing the commander's Blood Asp. Although heat flooded his mech's systems, Bridgewater slapped his own override buttons, routing even more power through the assault mech's fearsome array of weaponry. Gauss rounds followed heavy lasers, ripping through 4 points of armor on the enemy guillotine and ripping a limb containing a laser from the pirate mech. Dana attempted to aid her commander yet again, but had no angle on the guillotine, and instead opted to attempt to put the Crockett down for good. She led the target with her torso-mounted Gauss rifle and squeezed the trigger. She followed up the dense slug with the lash of a heavy particle projection cannon. This pulverized the Crockett's LBX autocannon. Lieutenant Carpenter had a narrow field of view to his target. He expertly threaded the needle, safely firing past his companions, and drove another pair of heavy slugs downrange. His target, the Capellan commander, in his Highlander, rocked from the impact. Carpenter followed the Gauss rifles with 2 PPCs, resulting in a total of 6 damage to the pirate mech. Critical damage ripped into the Highlander's fusion engine, nearly destroying it in a single salvo, but the Highlander managed to pull through, albeit missing its prized Gauss rifle. The Capellan Crusader, confusingly, shot over the heads of the two Galleon light tanks, opting to target the more distant Desert Scorpion tank. Missiles detonated in a ripple across the light tank, tearing 2 points of armor from it, but somehow it weathered the storm and managed to continue functioning at a reduced speed. The Cyclops took the easier approach. It swung its weapons downward, targeting the yet undamaged Galleon. It ripped into the light tank with 2 points of damage, ripping a tread off, along with all the remaining armor protection on the tank. The pirate Catapult, having fewer close-range weapons, tracked the slower tank, damaged by prior indirect attacks. He cut loose with a full flight of LRMs, detonating the tank in a cascade of smaller explosions. The Archer, unwilling to risk his target escaping, overrode his safeties and fired his full complement into the remaining Galleon, detonating it as well. This time, the tanks would not be recovered. With the deaths of the two tanker crews, the pirates pulled back control of the initiative. Both Kaya Whaley and Drew Trussell flanked Nico Clemens' Warhammer. John Byron and his Starslayer soared over the approaching mechs to flank the heavier Marauder as it thundered onward. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the two Desert Scorpion light tanks peeled off, ignoring the fire support lance and positioning to aid the main push occurring on the right flank of the Polaris battle line. Alpha Lance pulled back again, reacting to the heavy push from the Capellan Command Lance. They took up positions behind cover. Commander Bridgewater, his Blood Asp nearing the boiling point, had taken cover to allow his mech to vent the excess heat. The pirate fire support lance fired all of its indirect fire into the Desert Scorpion tanks, but somehow failed to score any hits. All the missile volleys arced wide and detonated harmlessly. Lieutenant Carpenter recognized the biggest threat left in the Capellan Command Lance was the guillotine, and he set his sights on it. It cowered behind cover as a full 7 points of damage ravaged the smaller battle mech, leaving only one structure point remaining and a damaged fusion engine. The Marauder was rocked on its haunches by a solid hit from Dana and her Caesar, dealing 2 points of damage to the heavy war machine. Nico took a shot at the Capellan Highlander with what remained of his Warhammer, but the attack was feeble and failed to provide any damage to the assault-class battle mech. Sergeant Byron let loose with his entire arsenal again, the heat spiking his cockpit to dangerous levels. This time, he struck the rear of the advancing Marauder, dealing a deadly 4 points of damage to the Capellan pirate, its structure now exposed and vulnerable. Trussell launched a flight of long-range missiles at the Crockett, dealing a point of damage as well as critically damaging a weapon system on the Crockett. Kaya's Vindicator lashed the vulnerable Marauder with PPC fire as it leapt into position on its jump jets. This caused a solid hit to the Marauder's fire control system, as well as 2 points of damage into the structure. The Marauder responded with a calculated strike at Nico's Warhammer. This kill would not escape. It dealt 2 damage to Nico's mount and critically damaged his fire control system as well. The pirate Highlander didn't have a clear shot, so instead focused his ire on the Vindicator. 2 points of damage ripped at the Vindicator's armor and caused an atmospheric breach into the afflicted region, but no critical damage resulted from the explosive decompression. The Crockett, seemingly sensing its impending doom, did not heed its heat output and fired every available weapon at Trussell's Griffin. Unfortunately for him, due to the increased heat already afflicting the battle mech, as well as the deft maneuvers of the smaller Griffin, all rounds failed to connect with the target and the Griffin escaped unscathed. Perhaps the Crockett had really been prophetic. When the Desert Scorpions triggered their large lasers at the Crockett, one shot lanced directly through into the exposed fusion engine, already damaged from prior engagement. The Crockett's pilot ejected as the fusion core approached critical levels, wreathing the mech in a fierce explosion. Bridgewater's mech was critically hot, and he allowed it to engage in its shutdown procedure. The enemy Highlander, having also pushed his heat to the envelope, also shut down to vent the excess. Polaris managed to keep their cool and maintain their initiative, putting the pirates on the back foot. The Marauder wheeled and backpedaled, trying to prevent its exposed rear arc from further exploitation, as the guillotine shifted to distance itself from the light tanks and the main core of the Polaris battle line. Byron leapt out of the way, landing behind the Marauder. Trussell and Whaley, ever the coordinated pair, soared over the shutdown Highlander to both oppose the guillotine as well as take advantage of the Capellan commander's moment of weakness. His heat was dangerously high, and he was nearing a shutdown, but if he could just last a little longer. The light tanks also raced forward, unwilling to let the guillotine escape their wrath. The fire support lance had finally pushed forward, realizing that if they maintained their distance, that they would be unable to bring the full might of their weaponry to bear, and this was the perfect opportunity to strike while the Bloodasp was helpless. The catapult was the most aggressive, leaping to the hardened rooftop to level its arsenal at the Polaris commander. Alpha Lance saw the impending threat too late. They attempted to reposition, but the commander could not power up his mech quickly enough to escape what was coming. Carpenter lined up his Devastator with the impending threat to his commander, but he was too far away to stop them. The guillotine was the first to take on the challenge that the paired mechs of Whaley and Trussell presented. He triggered his full complement of laser weaponry, washing the Vindicator in brilliant beams. The Vindicator armor failed, causing a breach, destroying 2 points of weaponry. The Marauder was not as capable. It fired its full complement as best as its heat would allow. The sluggishness of the controls made placing shots difficult, and it failed to do any damage to the Vindicator. Byrant landed deftly behind the Marauder and triggered a salvo with his Star Slayer, pumping lance after lance of laser fire into the rear of the heavy mech. This dealt another staggering 4 points of damage, adding to the fury of Whaley's simultaneous attacks. Whaley, while weathering the incoming fire, snapped off her own weaponry at the Marauder. The PPC arced through the core of the enemy battle mech and combined with the fury of the Star Slayer's assault. The Marauder slumped over. The pilot was either dead at its controls or unable to command it. Trussell twisted his Griffin to fire past Whaley. His target was the helpless Capellan commander. Frozen in place as he was, the Highlander withered under the Griffin's punishment, 3 damage gouging into its vulnerable flank. Dana Watcher opened up with the Gauss rifle in her Caesar, catching the guillotine unaware with a well-placed shot. The pirate mech collapsed in a heap. On the left flank, Carpenter struggled to effect the foregone conclusion. He pushed his Devastator to the limit, pumping round after round of nickel iron into the oncoming Cyclops, followed by particle projection cannon, one after another, but the fire support lance was undeterred. 7 points of damage ravaged the Cyclops, but its thick hide protected it well, and it did not waver. The catapult, having vaulted to the roof, triggered a full Alpha Strike on the commander's immobile Bloodasp. Already heavily damaged and unable to avoid the attack, the Bloodasp disappeared under a barrage of missiles and lasers. A thick veil of smoke and debris rose into the thin atmosphere. Elsewhere, the Archer and Crusader launched a volley of missiles at Whaley's Vindicator, but the distance and lack of available spotters proved too difficult, and the warheads impacted harmlessly off target. The Cyclops added its fury to the fight, not yet aware of the incoming punishment at the hands of Carpenter's Devastator, drilling into the flank of the lighter Vindicator and flipping it over on its front facing. The Vindicator cartwheeled, ending up on its back as smoke and fire poured from its many breaches. Trying to capitalize on their advantage, the mechs of the fire support lance continued advancing. The catapult utilized its jump jets to reach advantageous positions. The Cyclops, now the de facto commander of the pirate forces and attempting to secure a victory, maneuvered his machine to cover. The light tanks reacted by falling into the Cyclops' wake, positioning themselves behind the command mech. The remains of the Polaris forces attempted to make best use of their cover and braced to repel the last push the pirates would make. Targeting the most damaged mech on his sensors, the Cyclops pilot attempted to bring down Clemens' Warhammer, but his shots were fouled by the distance in the intervening structures. The catapult coordinated its fire onto the Warhammer as well, dealing a point of damage, but Clemens doggedly weathered the barrage. The Archer and the Crusader both added the weight of their indirect fire to the salvo, a fusillade of missiles smashing down around Clemens, but without reliable spotting, their accuracy left something to be desired. Properly enraged now, Lieutenant Carpenter stomped forward in his Devastator and continued to ensure his mount lived up to its namesake. More Ferris spheres mashed into the Cyclops, followed by particle cannon fire. 5 points of damage ripped through the remaining defenses of the Capellan mech, crippling its motive systems. Trussell leapt to defend his closest friend's downed Vindicator, also adding his own fury to the barrage. His missiles and PPC fire brought down the assault mech, finishing its rampage in a conflagration. Now free to pursue other targets, the light tanks rotated their turrets to bring their large lasers to bear on the Crusader rapidly approaching their flank. 2 points of damage slough off in the attack, venting atmosphere surrounding an actuator and damaging it in the resulting decompression, slowing the mech's movement. Watcher snapped Gauss rounds at the aggressive catapult, dealing 3 damage but failing to put the Capellan heavyweight down. After this last salvo, the firing ceased. The Capellans raised their weapons in a sign of surrender. Both their commander and second-in-command had been defeated. There were only 3 of them left against the infuriated Polaris remnants. There was nothing they could do if they wanted to make it out alive. Perhaps the Tarian courts would be merciful. This was the last battle in our ongoing campaign between Polaris and the Capellan Pirate forces. I had an ending written up, but for the sake of ambiguity, I decided to leave it open to interpretation. Do you think any of the Polaris leadership should have survived the destruction of their battle mechs? In the future, we'll be going to new battlegrounds, new timelines, and we'll be introducing new characters and forces. Please subscribe if you enjoy this content, and thank you so much for watching this far. Also, a big thank you goes out to my Patreon supporters, who get access to behind-the-scenes content and first looks at my current projects. Link is in the description if you want to check it out. These guys make it possible for me to continue making this kind of content, as their contributions allow me to introduce new mechs, battlegrounds, and filming equipment to improve the quality of the content. So until next time, the battle will continue.